Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Tonight we step into a world already burning. Picture a night sky over the city of Rome, the eternal city gone strangely dark at the edges, because for the first time, in longer than anyone alive can remember, the empire cannot promise you tomorrow. Roads that once carried grain and soldiers and letters from every corner of the known world now carry refugees. Watchtowers stand empty. Coins are so debased with cheap metal that merchants weigh them with suspicion before they'll even shake your hand. And somewhere out past the frontier, horses are gathering in the dark, more of them than any scout wants to count. If you lived through this honestly, you probably won't survive this, so let's be very glad you're only visiting, tucked safely into bed instead of standing on that crumbling wall. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, go ahead and drop your location and your local time down in the comments. It's always lovely to see just how far this story is traveling tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The world you are about to enter does not know yet that it is dying, and it does not know yet that it will be saved. It simply hurts the way an old wound hurts before you understand it has turned septic. This is Rome in the 1720s, year of its own founding, though its people would count it differently, would count it in emperors, and that right there is the problem. There are simply too many emperors. Too many men have discovered that with enough loyal soldiers and enough ambition, a purple cloak can be theirs, if only for a season, if only until the next general with a bigger bribe comes along. You have to understand what it felt like to live inside this particular collapse. It was not one dramatic invasion, one clean catastrophe you could point to and say, there, that is when it broke. It was slower and stranger than that, 100 small failures braiding together. Plague moves through the crowded cities in waves, the kind that empties whole apartment blocks and leaves market stalls untended, fruit rotting in the sun because there is no one left to sell it. Along the Rhine and the Danube, tribes that Rome once bought off with gold or crushed with legions now do neither. They simply walk in because the border, that ancient invisible line the empire swore was sacred, has become a suggestion. And here is the detail that tends to surprise people. The empire at its lowest point in this era is not one empire anymore. It is 3. In the west, along the rivers of Gaul and Britain and Spain, a breakaway state calls itself Roman but answers to its own emperor, a man who trusts none of his eastern cousins to defend him, and so has stopped waiting for their help entirely. In the east, out past Antioch, in the perfumed markets and colonnades of a desert city called Palmyra, another power has quietly stopped calling itself a mere province and started calling itself in all but name its own realm, and its ruler, as you'll come to learn, is far sharper and far more dangerous than Rome wants to admit. In between the two, clinging to Italy and the increasingly hollow title of the true empire, sits what remains of Roman authority, propped up by whichever general can keep his soldiers fed and his rivals dead. Historians still argue about exactly how bad it got, and about a strange old text that claims no fewer than 30 separate men tried to seize the throne in this stretch of chaos. A suspiciously tidy number, and most likely padded for drama, by a later writer who liked round figures more than accuracy. But you don't need the exact count to feel the truth underneath it. The truth is that authority itself has become a rumour. A father might tell his son that Rome rules the world, and the son might reasonably ask which Rome. Into this wreckage, almost without anyone in the capital noticing at first, a new name begins to travel along the supply roads and the barracks fires. Not a senator's name, not the name of some pampered aristocrat who inherited his rank the way he inherited his villas. A soldier's name spoken with a mixture of fear and grudging respect by men who do not hand out respect easily. He is said to have executed a nephew of his own with his bare hands for a breach of discipline. A story so brutal that even now you cannot be entirely sure how much of it is true and how much is legend built to keep tired soldiers marching in a straight line. What is certain is this: wherever this man's legion is stationed, the frontier holds a little longer than it should. You will meet him properly very soon, this man they will one day call, with barely any exaggeration at all, the restorer of the world. But right now, in this dying autumn of a broken empire, he is only a name whispered between campfires, a rumour of iron discipline drifting toward a capital that has forgotten what discipline even looks like. Somewhere on the Danube frontier, in a hard little province, most senators back in Rome couldn't find on a map a boy has already grown into that rumour. And it is there in the cold and the mud and the unforgiving drills of a border garrison that our story truly begins. He is born most likely somewhere along the Danube frontier, in a province called Moesia, or perhaps Pannonia. The sources cannot agree, and honestly neither could the man himself in later years, when it suited him to let his origins stay hazy. What everyone does agree on is the year sometime around 214 and the class he is born into, which is to say no class at all worth mentioning, not senatorial, not even comfortably middle rank. His father, by one persistent old story, works land that belongs to a wealthy senator, tending vines and grain on soil that isn't his, in a house that isn't his, under a name Aurelius, that some ancient writers claim was simply borrowed from the senator who owned the estate, the way a tenant farmer today might half in jest, half in resignation take on the name of the company he serves. Take that origin story with a grain of salt, because Roman biographers loved nothing more than dressing up a self-made man's humble start until it practically sparkled with symbolism. But even the skeptics agree on the shape of it. This is a boy with no inheritance, no family seal, no doors that opened simply because of his last name. What he does have from almost the moment he can walk is the frontier itself, and here is what you have to understand about growing up on that frontier. It does not let you be soft. This is not the golden marble columned Rome of postcards and mosaics. This is a hard country of river fog and pine forest where the wind off the Danube in winter can crack skin, and where the people on the far bank are not an abstract threat, discussed by senators in warm rooms. They are visible, some mornings standing on the opposite shore watching. A child raised here learns early that safety is not a given. It is something men with spears buy for you every single day, and the price is constant vigilance. So when young Aurelian enlists, and he enlists young, likely in his teenage years, as so many frontier boys did, because a legionary's pay and rations were more reliable than a bad harvest, he does not enter the army as a curious diversion, or a stepping stone toward polite society. He enters it because it is quite simply the only ladder available to him, and he intends to climb every single rung. And climb he does, but not gently. Picture him in these early years, not yet the grim commander history remembers, but a young trooper drilling at dawn in freezing mud, practicing the same sword strokes hundreds of times until his shoulders burn, because in the legions of this era sloppy technique gets you killed and dead soldiers are no use to anyone. The training is brutal by any modern standard, full marches under the weight of armor and supplies, mock combats with wooden blades weighted heavier than the real thing, so that actual battle feels almost easy by comparison, punishments for even minor lapses in discipline that would seem shockingly harsh to a viewer watching from the comfort of tonight's blankets. And here is the striking, well-documented fact worth sitting with for a moment. Roman military discipline in this period genuinely did permit decimation, the practice of executing 1 in every 10 men from a unit that had failed, catastrophically chosen essentially by lottery their own comrades, sometimes forced to carry out the killing. It was rare by Aurelian's time, more a historical memory than a routine practice. But the shadow of it still shaped how soldiers understood their world, a world where the group's survival could, in the most extreme circumstances, be bought with an individual's life. Grow up breathing that air, and you come out the other side believing in your bones that order is not a nicety. Order is survival. Now for the quirky detail, the one that tends to make people smile despite themselves. Later in life, once Aurelian has become a name soldiers use to frighten their own recruits into behaving, a nickname sticks to him: Manu ad ferrum, hand on the sword supposedly earned because during one campaign he killed a name-aging to pay almost comical number of enemies personally in a single day. A tally ancient sources cheerfully claim ran into the dozens, probably exaggerated, the way every good campfire story about a legendary officer tends to be exaggerated, each retelling adding a few more bodies to the pile. But soldiers do not repeat nicknames about men they secretly mock. They repeat nicknames about men they are on some level a little bit afraid of. And you have to admit, there's a certain dark comedy to it, an entire legion nervously making sure their boots were polished and their spears sharpened, all because their commanding officer had once allegedly gotten a bit carried away with a sword on a slow Tuesday. This is the furnace, then, that shapes him. Not privilege, not connections, but 2 straight decades of frontier discipline, of watching soft men die and hard men survive, of learning that mercy deployed carelessly gets good soldiers killed, while mercy deployed at exactly the right moment can bind an army to you with something stronger than fear. Remember that lesson, because it will resurface later in far bloodier circumstances than a training yard. By his 30s, he is no longer just another hard-drilled trooper lost in the ranks. Officers notice him, not because he charms them. By most accounts, charm is not exactly his strongest quality, but because wherever he commands, units perform better, hold longer, break less, often under pressure. Word travels up the chain the way it always does in armies, quietly, through the mouths of men who have actually stood shoulder to shoulder in a real fight and know exactly whose orders kept them breathing. And somewhere above him, ambitious emperors fighting their own desperate wars against invaders and rivals alike are beginning for the first time to ask a very useful question. Who is this Aurelian, and why does his legion never seem to fight? Break. That question is about to be answered in the worst possible way, through blood, through battle, and through a ruthless, relentless rise that will carry a penniless frontier boy several impossible steps closer to a throne he was never supposed to even glimpse. By the time Aurelian reaches his 40s, the empire around him has become a machine that consumes emperors the way a forge consumes coal, fast and without much ceremony. And yet, strangely, in this era of assassination and mutiny, this is precisely the kind of chaos that lets a talented outsider rise, because when the men at the top keep dying, someone competent has to fill the gap. And increasingly, that someone is him. Picture him now in his prime, no longer the raw teenage recruit shivering through frontier drills, but a hardened officer with a face weathered by 2 decades of campaign seasons, eyes that miss nothing, and a reputation that precedes him into every camp he enters. Under Emperor Valerian, he serves with such distinction that he is entrusted with cavalry, command no small thing, since cavalry in this era is increasingly where battles are actually won or lost, as the old infantry-heavy legions of the early empire give way to faster, more mobile forces built to chase down raiding tribes before they vanish back across the frontier with their plunder. Aurelian understands this shift instinctively, perhaps because he grew up watching exactly that kind of raiding on the Danube. He does not fight the way the textbooks from a century earlier would suggest. He fights the way the actual desperate moment demands. And here is where you need to picture the texture of a mid-3rd century battlefield, because it is nothing like the tidy, orderly clash of shields you might imagine. It is chaos and noise, and the smell of horse sweat and blood, officers screaming orders that half the men cannot hear over the din. An entire battle sometimes turning on nothing more than which side's soldiers lose their nerve first. Aurelian's genius, even this early, is that his men do not lose their nerve. Whatever fear moves through the ranks around him, it seems to slide off his own formations, because they trust with an almost superstitious certainty that their commander has already thought 3 moves ahead of the enemy. That trust is not accidental. He builds it the hard way through a combination that would feel almost contradictory in a gentler man's savage discipline paired with genuine, visible loyalty to the soldiers under him. He shares their rations on campaign rather than dining apart in comfort. He remembers names, remembers which unit performed well, at which crossing remembers grudges too, which soldiers frankly find almost more reassuring than forgetting them, because it means he is paying attention to everything. And when discipline breaks, he does not hesitate. The stories of his harshness only grow during these years. A soldier caught looting a civilian's home, by one account, executed on the spot, as an example, with Aurelian reportedly declaring, in effect, that Rome's soldiers were meant to defend the empire's people, not prey on them. Whether every detail of that story survived, the retelling intact, hardly matters. What matters is that the soldiers under him came to believe it, and belief is the only currency that keeps an army obedient when its emperor cannot pay them properly. Here's a detail that tends to catch people off guard, because it complicates the image of Aurelian as nothing but a blunt instrument of iron discipline. He is also, by multiple accounts, a genuinely skilled organizer of logistics, unglamorous but absolutely vital work of making sure grain and pack animals and spare weapons actually arrive where they're needed on time. In an empire whose road network is fraying at the edges, any general can win one dramatic battle. Far fewer generals can keep an army fed and equipped through an entire grinding campaign season, and it is this less flashy skill as much as his ferocity in a fight that marks him out to his superiors as a man built not just for one glorious charge but for the long, grinding work of actually holding an empire together. It's under Emperor Claudius, later remembered as Claudius Gothicus for his brutal victories against the Gothic tribes pressing into the Balkans, that Aurelian's star rises fastest. Claudius himself, a hard, capable soldier emperor, cut from similar frontier cloth, recognizes something of himself in this relentless cavalry commander and gives him increasing responsibility, eventually elevating him to one of the empire's most senior military positions. And here you have to pause and appreciate the strange, brutal logic of the age. In a healthier century, a man of Aurelian's background might never have risen past a mid-level officer's rank, blocked forever by senators and aristocrats who considered military command something close to their birthright. But this is not a healthy century. This is a century that has, through sheer, repeated catastrophe, learned to promote competence over pedigree, because the alternative is losing the next battle to a tribe that does not care one bit about your family tree. Under Claudius's banner, Aurelian plays a central role in one of the era's genuine bright spots, a massive, hard-fought victory against invading Goths near Naissus in the Balkans, a battle so significant that ancient writers, admittedly prone to exaggeration, credit the Romans with slaughtering tens of thousands of the enemy and effectively breaking the Gothic threat to the region for a generation. Modern historians are understandably more cautious about those staggering numbers. Ancient casualty figures have a habit of inflating themselves with every retelling, the way a fish grows a little longer every time the story is told at the tavern. But even stripped of exaggeration, Naissus stands as a real turning point, a moment where the empire for once did not simply survive a crisis, but actually won decisively, and Aurelian's cavalry is remembered as instrumental in that victory, riding down the fleeing enemy with the same relentless discipline he demanded on the training ground years before. He returns from that campaign no longer a rising officer among many. He returns a name. Soldiers speak it with respect bordering on awe. Rivals speak it with the particular wariness reserved for men who might one day soon be standing above them rather than beside them. And back in the fractured capital, where emperors rise and fall with dizzying speed, powerful men are beginning to watch this frontier-born cavalry commander very, very closely, because the throne, as everyone in this brutal era has learned, rarely goes to the man with the best bloodline. It goes to the man the army trusts to keep them alive. And right now there may be no man in the empire the army trusts more than Aurelian. The plague does not care that Claudius is an emperor. That is perhaps the cruelest lesson of this entire era, that the same invisible sickness sweeping through crowded army camps and the tenement blocks of ordinary cities does not pause out of respect for purple robes. In the year 270, not long after his triumph at Naissus, Claudius falls ill. You have to picture the mood in the camp as word spread. Soldiers who had followed this man through a brutal, victorious campaign, who trusted him with their lives on the battlefield, now standing outside his tent, listening for updates, watching physicians come and go with increasingly grim expressions. This is not a death in battle, glorious and quick. This is the slow, undignified death that killed so many in this century, regardless of rank, fever, weakness, the wasting away of a man who had only recently seemed indestructible. And here is what you have to understand about death at the top of this empire during this particular decade. It is never simply a private tragedy. It is a political earthquake, because the moment an emperor dies without an obvious unchallenged heir, every ambitious general within marching distance starts doing quiet arithmetic about his own chances. Claudius, in his final days, apparently names his brother Quintillus as a preferred successor, a reasonable, if somewhat desperate attempt to keep power within a bloodline that barely exists yet. Quintillus back in Italy moves quickly to claim the throne, and for a few tense weeks it almost works. But the army on the frontier, the men who actually fought and bled at Nasus, do not particularly care about Quintillus. They were not there. They did not share rations with him in the mud. What they know with the particular clarity that soldiers develop about who actually deserves command is that their cavalry commander, this relentless, iron-willed man who never lost his nerve in a real fight, is standing right there among them. And so, in the raw, chaotic days after Claudius's death, in a scene that must have felt less like a coronation and more like a decision reached around a campfire, the army does what Roman armies had increasingly taken to doing. Throughout this troubled century, they simply declare their own commander, emperor, whether the Senate in Rome has any say in the matter or not. You have to sit with the strangeness of this moment because it tells you something important about what the empire has actually become underneath all its old grand titles. This is not a coronation with incense and ancient ritual senators in white togas debating precedent in a marble chamber. This is a circle of exhausted, battle-hardened men, some of them probably still nursing wounds from the last campaign, raising their voices and their weapons for a man they trust to keep them alive, because in this era, that is genuinely the only qualification that matters anymore. Historians still debate exactly how reluctant Aurelian truly was in this moment. Some ancient accounts paint him as almost hesitant, weighing the impossible burden he was being handed, while others suggest a man who had been quietly positioning himself for exactly this outcome for years. Both readings might contain some truth. Ambition and reluctance are not always opposites. Sometimes a man wants the throne desperately, and still understands with total clarity just how likely it is to get him killed. And it is worth pausing on that danger for a moment, because here is the striking historical fact that anchors this entire chaotic period in the 50 years before Aurelian's rise. The empire had churned through so many emperors, many of them murdered by their own soldiers or rivals within months of taking power, that modern historians simply call this stretch of Roman history the crisis of the 3rd century, and some counts put the average reign of an emperor during the worst of it at barely 2 or 3 years before a violent end. Taking this throne is not a reward. It is closer to a death sentence with excellent seating. Quintillus, meanwhile, back in Italy, faces the brutal math of his own position, an army that never fought under him versus an army that had just watched Aurelian win. Ancient sources differ on exactly how his brief reign ends, some claiming he took his own life once he understood the situation was hopeless, others suggesting his own soldiers turned against him once Aurelian's superior claim became obvious. Either way, within weeks the contest is over, almost embarrassingly quickly given how violent so many other succession struggles in this century had been. Aurelian, the tenant farmer's son from the Danube frontier, the boy who enlisted because it was the only ladder available to him, is now, astonishingly, the sole ruler of what remains of the Roman Empire. But here is the darkly comic detail worth savouring for a moment, a small flicker of dry wit in an otherwise grim story by most accounts. Aurelian receives less an enthusiastic celebration and more a horrifying inventory. Picture him freshly acclaimed, being handed reports from every corner of what is technically still his empire, and each report is somehow worse than the last. The treasury is nearly empty. The coinage is so debased that merchants have started refusing to trust it outright. 2 entire chunks of what should be his territory, the rich provinces of Gaul and Britain in the west and the wealthy trade routes of Syria and Egypt in the east, do not currently recognize his authority at all, having each set up their own rival rulers. It is, by any reasonable measure, one of the worst inheritances any man has ever received, while simultaneously being told to be grateful for it. And yet, remarkably, this is exactly the kind of impossible mess that a lifetime of frontier discipline and hard-won cavalry command has prepared him for. Where a softer man, a senator's son, raised on comfort and flattery, might have looked at this shattered inheritance and quietly negotiated some face-saving peace with the breakaway territories, Aurelian looks at the same map and sees instead a series of problems to be solved one at a time, with exactly the same ruthless efficiency he once applied to training frightened recruits on the Danube. He does not yet know it, standing there amid the wreckage of an empire that barely deserves the name anymore. But he is about to spend the next 5 years fighting almost without pause, and the very first fire he will have to put out is not some distant rebel emperor at all, It is a storm of tribal warriors already pouring across the Alps, heading straight for Italy, straight for Rome itself, faster than anyone in the capital wants to believe. Before we follow Aurelian into that oncoming storm, you need to see the map the way he saw it spread out in his command tent by flickering lamplight, because the shape of this broken empire is almost impossible to imagine if you've only ever known Rome as it appears in your mind's eye, vast, unified, eternal. What Aurelian actually inherits looks more like a cracked mirror, each fragment still reflecting a piece of the old glory, but no longer connected to the others at all. Start in the west because that's where the crack runs deepest. Roughly a decade before Aurelian takes power, a general named Postumus, stationed along the Rhine frontier, grew tired of watching the central government fail again and again to actually defend Gaul from raiding tribes. So he did something that on paper sounds almost reasonable, and in practice, there was nothing short of revolutionary. He simply stopped waiting for Rome. He declared his own empire, complete with its own senate, its own consuls, its own mint, striking its own coins, covering Gaul, Britain, and parts of Spain. And here is the detail that tends to surprise people the most. This breakaway Gallic Empire was not some ramshackle warlord's fiefdom. It was, by most measures, a genuinely functional state, arguably better organized in its early years than the central empire it had abandoned, because its rulers, freed from the endless political knife-fighting of Rome, could actually focus their attention on the one job that mattered most to the people living there, keeping the tribes on the far side of the Rhine from burning down their farms. Postumus himself is long dead by the time Aurelian takes the throne, murdered by his own mutinous troops in a grim irony that this era specializes in, and by now the Gallic Empire is ruled by a reluctant, weary man named Tetricus, who you will come to know rather intimately before this story is through. Now, travel east all the way across the Mediterranean, past Greece, past Anatolia, down into the golden light and cedar-scented air of Syria, and you arrive at a city that seems frankly to belong to a different world entirely, Palmyra, an ancient caravan city rising out of the desert, like something conjured, its wealth built over centuries on the silk and spice routes that once connected Rome to Persia and India, and lands even further east. For years, Palmyra had been a loyal, even beloved Roman ally, its ruler Odaenathus, doing much of Rome's dirty work in the east, fighting off the resurgent Persian Empire when Rome's own emperor humiliatingly had been captured in battle and never returned. But Odaenathus too is dead now, assassinated in circumstances that remain murky even to modern historians, some pointing to a family feud, others hinting at darker political currents. And in his place rules someone Rome had badly underestimated, his widow, a woman who has, in the years since her husband's death, quietly and methodically expanded Palmyra's reach far beyond anything Rome had ever sanctioned until it stretches across Syria into Egypt, up into much of Anatolia, an empire within an empire, glittering and increasingly unwilling to answer to anyone in Rome at all. You'll meet her properly very soon, and I promise you she deserves every bit of the build-up. And here is where you have to feel the full, dizzying strangeness of Aurelian's position, because sandwiched between these two breakaway powers sits what is technically still the real Roman Empire. Battered core clinging to legitimacy, mostly through tradition and the stubborn presence of the city of Rome itself. But even this core is hollowed out. The mainstream historical fact worth sitting with here is almost hard to believe the silver coinage that once symbolized Roman stability and reach across 3 continents had by this point in the crisis been debased so severely that some coins contained barely a whisper of actual silver, sometimes as little as a few percent, the rest cheap base metal, dressed up with a thin silver wash that would tarnish and reveal the fraud within weeks of leaving the mint. Imagine handing someone a coin, watching them scratch its surface with a fingernail out of pure habit distrust baked so deeply into daily transactions that an entire economy runs on suspicion rather than confidence. Here's the smaller, stranger detail that doesn't make it into most textbooks but paints the picture just as vividly in some frontier regions during this crisis. Soldiers' pay arrived so irregularly and in such worthless currency that garrisons effectively slid back into a barter. Economy, trading, grain rations and salt, and even boots directly with local farmers because nobody, soldier or civilian, particularly trusted the coins stamped with whichever emperor happened to be alive that month. You have to imagine the absurdity of it, a legionary sworn to defend the majesty of Rome, quietly haggling over a sack of turnips because his official salary is functionally worthless. Beyond even these three major fractures, smaller cracks spread everywhere you look. Provinces in North Africa flirt with their own rebellions. Cities across Italy fortify themselves independently, no longer trusting the central government to protect them. A telling sign in itself, since Rome had gone centuries without needing walls at all, so confident was it in its own invincibility. And it is precisely this creeping provincial fear cities, quietly building their own defenses because they no longer believe help is coming, that should worry you most as we move forward, because it means the danger closing in on Italy, right? Now is not some distant rumor from a far frontier. It is close. It is coming fast. And as Aurelian settles into a throne balanced atop this shattered mirror of an empire, word reaches him that a massive coalition of tribal warriors, the Juthungi, and their allies have already crossed into Roman territory to the north, moving with startling speed toward the one place nobody in living memory has dared to threaten directly. They are moving toward Italy itself, toward Rome. You can feel the shift in the air before the messengers even arrive, the way farmers along the northern frontier claim they can smell a coming storm before the first cloud appears. Word travels down through the Alpine, passes in fragments. At first a burned granary here, a missing patrol there, and then, all at once, the fragments assemble into something unmistakable and terrifying. A massive coalition of tribal warriors, led primarily by the Juthungi, with Vandal allies swelling their ranks, has crossed the Danube frontier and is moving south, not raiding and retreating the way tribes usually did, snatching cattle and found, vanishing back across the river before Roman forces could respond, but pushing deeper, faster, with an audacity that suggests they have looked at the fractured, plague-weakened empire and concluded correctly that this might finally be their moment. And here is what you have to understand about how genuinely unthinkable this is, even in an era already thick with catastrophe. Italy itself, the Roman heartland, has not faced a serious foreign invasion in centuries. Generations of Romans have grown up secure in the almost mythic belief that whatever chaos consumed the frontiers, whatever emperor rose or fell in some distant province, the peninsula itself, the sacred soil where Rome stood, remained untouchable, protected by a buffer of provinces and armies so deep that no enemy could ever realistically punch through to the capital. That belief is about to be shattered, and you can imagine the particular flavor of dread spreading through Italian towns as the news arrives. A dread sharpened precisely because it contradicts everything people thought they knew about their own safety. Aurelian, newly acclaimed and barely settled into the impossible weight of his throne, does not have the luxury of easing into command. He marches north almost immediately, gathering what forces he can along the way. And here is where you begin to see the particular shape of his generalship. Under maximum pressure, not cautious, not defensive, but aggressive, almost to the point of recklessness, because he seems to understand instinctively that half measures against an invasion this size will only invite worse to follow. And for a moment, that aggression pays off. Roman forces meet the invaders, and in an initial engagement manage to check their advance, forcing the tribal coalition to pull back toward the Danube, seemingly satisfied, or at least sufficiently bloodied, to abandon their push into Italy. But here is the open loop I want you to sit with for a moment, the little seed of dread that should not leave you even as this first small victory seems to close the danger, because the Juthungi and their Vandal allies do not simply vanish back across the frontier and stay there. And here's what you have to understand about the psychology of an army that has already tasted blood on Roman soil. Once retreat for them is not defeat, it is repositioning. Somewhere out beyond the frontier, in councils Aurelian cannot see and cannot influence, tribal leaders are already reconsidering gathering their strength, watching Roman movements, waiting for the moment when the new emperor's attention drifts elsewhere, as it inevitably must, because an empire this vast and this broken cannot be defended everywhere at once. Meanwhile, back within Italy itself, the psychological damage of even this brief incursion cannot be overstated. You have to picture ordinary people, farmers, merchants, city officials in towns that had never so much as rehearsed a siege, suddenly confronting the very real possibility that the war might come to their own doorstep. Trade routes that had operated for generations without a second thought are disrupted. Grain shipments are delayed as roads become clogged with both military traffic and nervous civilians, uncertain whether to flee toward the presumed safety of Rome or simply hunker down and hope the danger passes them by. It is in miniature, a preview of exactly the kind of fear that will soon grip the capital itself, and it plants a seed of urgency in Aurelian's mind, though he has at this exact moment no time to properly cultivate it, because messengers keep arriving from every direction with fresh crises demanding his attention. Here is a striking mainstream historical fact worth pausing on. The very speed and scale of this invasion is part of what modern historians point to as compelling evidence for a broader pattern reshaping the entire European continent during, in this century, a slow-motion chain reaction sometimes, called the migration period, in which pressure from tribes and peoples even further east and north was pushing groups like the Juthungi and Vandals to move in turn toward Roman territory. Less out of simple opportunism, and more out of genuine desperation for land and resources. Aurelian, of course, has no grand theory of continental migration patterns available to him. He has only the immediate, brutal fact of armed men on Roman soil and a fractured empire behind him that cannot afford another humiliation. And here's the quirky, lesser-known detail that adds a strange flicker of dark humor to this otherwise grim picture. Roman military intelligence in this period relied heavily on a somewhat undignified network of paid informants and captured prisoners for interrogation, and more than one. Ancient source suggests that Roman commanders, Aurelian, very likely included, had grown accustomed to treating captured tribal chieftains not as prisoners to be executed outright, but as walking encyclopedias, extracting whatever information could be squeezed from them about troop movements, alliances, and morale before deciding their fate. There's something almost comically pragmatic about it, this image of grim, battle-hardened Roman officers sitting across from a captured enemy leader, offering just enough comfort and just enough threat to get him talking, all in the service of avoiding the next ambush. But that pragmatism, that hard-won caution, is about to fail Aurelian in the worst possible way, because even as this first wave of invaders pulls back toward the frontier, seemingly beaten, the Juthungi coalition is already regrouping in the shadow of the Alps, gathering allies, sharpening their intent, and preparing for a second push, one that will not stop at the frontier this time, one that will drive deep into the heart of Italy itself and catch Aurelian's forces in a position so exposed, so nearly catastrophic, that for one long and terrible night it will seem entirely possible that Rome itself is about to fall. The place is called Placentia, a modest city in northern Italy along the Po River Valley, and it is here in the deepening gloom of a poorly chosen battlefield that Aurelian comes closer to losing everything than at any other point in his entire reign. You have to picture the terrain first, because terrain is the villain of this particular story almost as much as the enemy is. Dense forest crowds close around the roads in this region, the kind of tangled woodland that swallows sound and sight lines, both where a scout riding 20 paces ahead of the main column can vanish from view entirely, and where an army, accustomed to fighting in open country, suddenly finds all its advantages stripped away. The Juthungi and their Vandal allies, having regrouped after their earlier retreat, understand this terrain far better than the Romans chasing them, and they use that knowledge with a cunning that should unsettle you, because it reveals just how badly Roman intelligence had underestimated this enemy. Rather than meeting Aurelian's forces in open battle, where Roman discipline and formation fighting would almost certainly favour the legions, the tribal coalition draws the Roman column deep into the forest near Placentia, and then in the fading light of evening springs an ambush from multiple directions at once. And here is what you have to understand about what an ambush actually feels like from inside a Roman marching column, because it is nothing like the clean, decisive battles you might picture from a history book illustration. It is confusion first, before anything else, shouting from the flanks that soldiers in the center of the column cannot immediately place. Officers screaming contradictory orders, because no one, not even the most experienced veterans, can get a clear view of what's actually happening through the trees. Formations that took years to drill into instinct, the tight, mutually protective shield walls that make Roman infantry so devastating in open ground, become almost impossible to maintain when the enemy is emerging from three sides simultaneously, and the terrain itself won't allow proper spacing between units. Casualties mount with a speed that must have been genuinely horrifying even to veteran soldiers who had seen plenty of hard fighting before. Ancient sources, admittedly prone to their usual dramatic exaggeration, describe the Roman force as being nearly destroyed outright. And while modern historians rightly treat the most extreme casualty figures with skepticism, there is broad agreement on the essential fact underneath the exaggeration: this was not a minor setback. This was a genuine, serious defeat, one of the worst Roman forces suffer in this entire 5-year span. And for a brief, terrifying window, the road to Rome itself lies essentially undefended. And here is where you need to feel the full weight of what that actually meant, because this is the moment the fear from the earlier incursion, the anxious rumors spreading through Italian towns, stops being anxiety and becomes something closer to genuine panic. Word of the disaster at Placentia reaches Rome before Aurelian's own scattered forces can regroup, and the ancient sources describe scenes bordering on hysteria within the capital itself. Officials debating whether the city's old, largely ornamental fortifications could possibly hold against a determined tribal assault priests, consulting sacred texts and omens for guidance ordinary citizens, genuinely wondering whether they should flee south while the roads remained open. Remember the walls that don't exist yet, the ones Rome has gone comfortably without for centuries because no one seriously believed they'd ever be needed. That comfortable assumption is about to look like one of the most dangerous miscalculations in the empire's history, and this single, terrifying night at Placentia is exactly where that realization crystallizes. Here's the striking mainstream fact worth sitting with, because it captures just how unprecedented this moment truly was. Rome had not faced a credible threat of direct invasion since the days of Hannibal nearly 5 centuries earlier, and even that ancient memory had faded into something closer to legend than living fear, an entire civilization's worth of confidence, built on the assumption that Italy itself was simply beyond the reach of any enemy, cracks open in a single, catastrophic evening in a forest most Romans back in the capital couldn't have located on a map. And yet, and this is crucial to understanding the man we're following, Aurelian himself does not break even as his army very nearly does. Ancient accounts, filtered though they are through later admiration for the emperor, who would go on to save the empire, describe him personally, rallying scattered units in the chaotic aftermath, refusing to accept that this single disaster meant final defeat, pulling together whatever forces remained cohesive, and beginning almost immediately the grim work of reorganizing for a counterstrike rather than a retreat. It is worth noting, with a flicker of the dry wit, this story occasionally allows itself that this is a man whose entire life has been one long preparation for catastrophe, decades on the frontier watching things go wrong, learning that panic kills faster than any enemy sword, and that single lesson hammered into him since boyhood may be the only reason there is still a functioning Roman army left to fight with after Placentia at all. Historians still debate the precise scale of the defeat, and even some of the exact tactical details, since the surviving accounts were written decades later and shaped understandably by the desire to make Aurelian's eventual triumph seem all the more remarkable by contrast. But whatever the exact numbers, the psychological impact is beyond dispute. This is the closest the city of Rome comes, in this entire 5-year saga, to facing a genuine existential threat from an external enemy at its own gates. And it is precisely because of how close that threat comes, how thoroughly it shatters centuries of complacent assumptions about the capital's safety, that Aurelian makes a decision in the aftermath that will outlast his own reign, outlast the crisis itself, and quite literally reshape the physical outline of the city of Rome for more than 1,000 years to come. In the weeks after Placentia, once the immediate danger has been contained, and the shattered remnants of the Roman column have been pulled back into some semblance of order, Aurelian does something that tells you everything about how this near disaster has reshaped his thinking. He does not simply issue a triumphant proclamation claiming the crisis is over, the way a weaker or more image-conscious ruler might have eager to paper over the fear with premature celebration. Instead, he looks directly at the uncomfortable truth that Placentia exposed, that Rome itself, the eternal city, the supposed untouchable heart of the empire, has no meaningful defenses whatsoever, and he decides to fix it permanently, immediately regardless of the cost. You have to picture the city of Rome as it actually stood at this point, because it is almost startling by modern standards. This is a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 people or more sprawling across its famous 7 hills and well beyond them into surrounding suburbs, and yet its only real fortification is a set of walls built nearly 7 centuries earlier, during the era of the old Roman kings' walls that had long since been swallowed up by the city's own growth, with entire neighborhoods now sitting well outside their protective circuit. For centuries this hadn't mattered because no enemy had ever come close enough to test it. Placentia changes that calculus overnight. So Aurelian orders the construction of an entirely new circuit of walls, one that will come to be known appropriately enough as the Aurelian Walls, and here is where you need to appreciate the sheer, almost unbelievable scale of what he is proposing. This is not a modest reinforcement of a few vulnerable gates. This is a continuous fortified perimeter stretching for roughly 19 kilometers, encircling the entire expanded city, incorporating existing buildings and monuments directly into the wall's structure, wherever practical, to save time and material. Brick and concrete rising in places to heights of 6 meters or more, punctuated by towers spaced at close, deliberate intervals to allow defenders overlapping fields of fire against any future attacker foolish enough to test them. And here is the striking historical fact that should genuinely astonish you when you sit with it. This massive undertaking, one of the largest urban fortification projects in the entire history of the ancient world, is completed in a remarkably short span of time, likely within just a handful of years, using a combination of military labor, conscripted civilian workers, and existing structures cleverly repurposed as ready-made wall segments. Compare that to other great building projects of the ancient world, temples and aqueducts that sometimes took generations to finish, and you begin to appreciate just how urgently Aurelian pushed this work forward, driven by the very real fear that another Placentia might be only a season away. Here's the detail that tends to delight people once they picture it properly. A small, almost darkly funny irony buried inside this desperate defensive project, because speed mattered more than architectural purity. Aurelian's builders simply incorporated whatever existing structures happened to sit along their planned route directly into the wall itself, rather than tearing them down and rebuilding from scratch. An enormous pyramid-shaped tomb belonging to a wealthy Roman official from centuries earlier, built in a fit of Egyptian-inspired fashion during a period when all things Egyptian were briefly the height of aristocratic taste, simply gets absorbed wholesale into the new fortifications, its ancient stone flank, becoming quite literally a section of Rome's defensive wall. Imagine being a guard posted to that section centuries later, standing watch atop what used to be some long-dead nobleman's very expensive vanity project, now doing far more practical work than its original owner ever could have imagined. And here is where the deeper significance of these walls becomes clear, well beyond their immediate military purpose, because they represent something almost painful for Romans to admit even as they build them: a formal physical acknowledgement that the age of effortless Roman invincibility is over. For centuries, the absence of walls around the capital had itself been a kind of propaganda, a statement to the world that Rome needed no such protection, that its legions and its reputation alone were sufficient shield. Now that unspoken boast is being quietly dismantled brick by brick, replaced with the far more sober, far more honest admission that the empire's enemies have grown bold enough and Rome's own strength uncertain enough, that the capital itself must be defended like any other vulnerable city. Historians still debate how consciously Aurelian and his contemporaries understood this symbolic shift versus simply reacting to the immediate practical threat. But either reading carries real weight. Sometimes the most profound historical turning points arrive dressed in the practical clothing of an engineering project rather than a grand political declaration. You should also sit for a moment with the sheer human cost and effort involved, the kind of detail that rarely makes it into triumphant historical summaries. Thousands of labourers, many of them soldiers, pulled away from active campaigning at a time when the empire desperately needed every available fighting man on its actual frontiers. Spend months hauling brick and mixing mortar under Aurelian's relentless supervision, because he understands with the same instinctive urgency that shaped his entire military career that a half-finished wall is worse than no wall. At all an invitation rather than a deterrent. By the time the bulk of the construction nears completion, Rome possesses something it has not needed in living memory and will remarkably continue needing for centuries afterward, as these very walls go on to be maintained, reinforced and differentiated. Fought over by defenders facing threats Aurelian himself could never have anticipated, all the way through the eventual fall of the Western Empire and well beyond. But right now, in this urgent moment, the walls exist for one purpose, only to buy Aurelian the breathing room he desperately needs to turn his attention back to the battlefield, because the Juthungi coalition that so nearly destroyed his army at Placentia has not been defeated, only delayed. And somewhere beyond the Alps they are almost certainly already preparing for one more attempt at the prize that so narrowly slipped through their fingers. With the walls of Rome rising brick by brick behind him, and with the memory of Placentia still raw enough to sharpen every decision he makes, Aurelian turns back north to finish what that near catastrophe left unresolved. And here is what you have to appreciate about his state of mind in this moment, because it marks a genuine shift in the man himself. The Aurelian who marched north at the very start of his reign was confident, aggressive, perhaps even slightly reckless, a general who had never truly tasted defeat and assumed his usual iron discipline would simply carry the day against any enemy. The Aurelian marching north now is something else entirely, chastened, sharpened, and far more dangerous for it, because he has learned, in the most brutal way possible, exactly what this enemy is capable of when underestimated. The Juthungi coalition, for their part, has not been idle in the intervening weeks. Emboldened by their victory at Placentia, and likely swelling their ranks with opportunistic allies drawn by rumours of Roman weakness, they push further into Italy than before, moving with the confidence of a force that has already beaten the emperor once and sees no particular reason to fear him. Now, you have to imagine the mood among their war leaders. At this stage, a heady, dangerous overconfidence, the kind that has undone more than one victorious army throughout history. The assumption that because a strategy works spectacularly once, it will simply work again. That overconfidence is about to be punished severely, because Aurelian has spent the weeks since Placentia doing exactly what his entire life had trained him to do in the aftermath of failure. Not sulking, not making excuses, but methodically studying what went wrong and rebuilding his approach from to the ground up. He reorganizes his forces, tightens his intelligence network, and this time, crucially, refuses to be drawn into the kind of dense, disadvantageous terrain that cost him so dearly before. When the two armies finally meet again near the city of Fano along Italy's eastern coast, Aurelian has chosen his ground with far greater care, and the results show it almost immediately. Picture the battle itself unfolding in more open country this time, terrain that actually favours Roman discipline and formation fighting rather than sabotaging it the way the forests near Placentia had. The tribal coalition, still riding high on their earlier success, presses forward with characteristic aggression, expecting the same disorganised panic that had served them so well before. Instead, they run directly into tight, disciplined Roman lines that hold their formation under pressure, absorbing the initial shock of the charge rather than shattering under it, and slowly, grindingly begin turning the tribal momentum back on itself. This is Aurelian's frontier training made visible on a massive scale. The same relentless drilling that once shaped frightened recruits on the Danube, now producing an army that simply refuses to break no matter how hard it is pushed. The victory at Fano is decisive, and here is where you should feel the emotional wave of this story genuinely cresting after the despair of Placentia, because the tribal coalition, having lost the initiative and a significant portion of their fighting strength, begins falling back in a retreat that increasingly resembles a rout. Aurelian, showing none of the caution that a more conservative commander might have exercised after such a hard-won victory, presses the pursuit relentlessly, refusing to let the beaten enemy regroup and reorganize for another attempt. This pursuit culminates in a second major engagement near Pavia, Further north, where the remaining tribal forces, exhausted, demoralized, and increasingly fragmented, are effectively crushed. Here is the striking mainstream historical fact worth sitting with, because ancient sources, admittedly given to their usual dramatic flourishes, describe the scale of the Roman victory at Pavia in terms that suggest something close to annihilation for the Juthungi coalition as a fighting force. Their capacity to threaten Italy directly essentially destroyed for a generation to come. Modern historians, as always, treat the most extreme numbers with appropriate skepticism, but the broader strategic outcome is not seriously disputed. Whatever the precise casualty figures, the threat that had come within a hair's breadth of reaching Rome itself only weeks earlier has been comprehensively neutralized. And here's the quirky, lesser-known detail that adds a welcome flicker of dry humor to this hard-fought triumph. Roman soldiers in this period had developed something of a grim professional pride around what ancient writers occasionally reference as trophy-taking after a decisive victory. Displays of captured enemy weapons and standards arranged quite theatrically, for the benefit of both their own morale and any watching civilians nervously awaiting news from the front. You can imagine the scene: battle-weary soldiers, some of them the very same men who had barely survived Placentia weeks earlier, now arranging captured shields and spears with almost showman-like satisfaction, because after the terror of that earlier defeat, they have more than earned a little theatrical bragging. But there is something else worth noting here too, something that reveals the more complicated side of Aurelian's character, beyond simple battlefield ruthlessness. Accounts from this campaign suggest that once the tribal coalition's military threat was broken, he did not pursue a policy of total extermination or endless punitive raiding into their home territory. Rather than dragging the war on indefinitely to satisfy pure vengeance for Placentia, he appears to have judged with the same pragmatic instinct that shaped his logistics work earlier in his career, that a broken enemy left with some path back to peaceful coexistence causes less future trouble than a desperate enemy fighting with nothing left to lose. Historians still debate how much of this restraint was genuine strategic wisdom because word has already begun reaching him, even as the last mopping up operations near Pavia wind down, that Italy's crisis, however dramatically resolved, was never the only fire burning across his fractured empire. Far to the east, in the golden light of the Syrian desert, a rival power has grown bolder and more ambitious with every month that Rome's attention stayed fixed on the northern frontier. And it is time at last for Aurelian to turn his gaze toward a threat unlike any he has faced before, not a tribal coalition testing Rome's borders, but a queen who believes with considerable justification that she has already built an empire capable of standing entirely on its own. With Italy secured and the immediate terror of invasion pushed back beyond memory of panic, Aurelian allows himself, for perhaps the first time since taking the throne, a brief window to actually consider the rest of his fractured empire, rather than simply reacting to whichever crisis screams loudest. And what he sees when he finally turns his full attention eastward is not a simple rebellious province waiting to be reminded of its obligations. It is something far more complicated, far more dangerous, and if he is being entirely honest with himself, something that commands a grudging measure of respect even as it demands to be dismantled. You have to understand the strange, almost accidental path that led to this situation, because it did not begin as an act of rebellion at all. Years earlier, when a previous Roman emperor suffered one of the most humiliating disasters in the empire's long history, captured alive in battle by the resurgent Persian Empire, and by some ancient accounts, kept as a living trophy of Persian triumph for the remainder of his life, a detail so shocking it left permanent psychological scars on Roman self-image. It was not a Roman general who stepped into the resulting power vacuum in the east. It was Odaenathus, ruler of the wealthy caravan city of Palmyra, technically still a Roman client but functioning in practice as an independent power broker who possessed the military strength and local knowledge that Rome, in its moment of catastrophic weakness, simply lacked. Odaenathus drove Persian forces back, stabilized the eastern frontier almost single-handedly, and did so with such effectiveness that Rome, desperate and grateful, showered him with titles and honors, effectively legitimizing an arrangement in which the eastern half of the empire's defense rested not on Roman legions, but on Palmyrene ambition. And then Odaenathus dies suddenly and violently, the exact circumstances still debated by historians to this day, some pointing toward a family dispute gone lethal, others suspecting a wider conspiracy that has never been fully unraveled. Into the vacuum left by his death steps his widow, and it is here that our story acquires one of its most genuinely compelling figures. A ruler who deserves every bit of the attention this section is about to give her. Picture her first simply as history remembers her physically, because ancient sources, admittedly writing with the usual embellishments, reserved for powerful women who unsettled Roman sensibilities, describe her as striking in appearance with dark, penetrating eyes and a bearing that commanded attention the moment she entered a room. Though you should treat these particular details with the same healthy skepticism you'd apply to any ancient writer's description of a woman he clearly found both impressive and threatening. What matters far more than her appearance, and what the sources agree on with far greater consistency, is her intellect. She is described as fluent in multiple languages, including Egyptian Greek and the local Aramaic dialects of her own region, and deeply engaged with philosophy, reportedly keeping learned scholars close to her court, not merely for decoration, but for genuine intellectual companionship and counsel. Her name is Zenobia, and here is what you have to understand about the audacity of what she does in the years following her husband's death, because it goes far beyond simply holding on to the regional authority he had built. Ruling nominally as regent for her young son, but wielding power with an authority entirely her own, Zenobia begins expanding Palmyrene control in ways that leave increasingly little doubt about her actual ambitions. Roman Egypt, one of the empire's wealthiest and most strategically vital provinces, the very breadbasket that keeps Rome itself fed through regular grain shipments, falls under her control. Large portions of Anatolia follow. What began as a loyal client kingdom defending Rome's eastern frontier has transformed within a remarkably short span of years into something that functions in nearly every practical sense as its own independent empire, minting its own coinage, exercising its own administrative control, answering to Rome in name only, and increasingly not even that. Here is the striking mainstream historical fact worth pausing on because it captures the sheer scale of what Zenobia achieved and why Rome could not simply ignore her indefinitely at the height of her power. The territory under her control stretched from the eastern Mediterranean coast through Syria, down through Egypt, and up into significant portions of Asia Minor, encompassing some of the wealthiest, most productive, most strategically critical land in the entire ancient world. This was not a minor provincial uprising to be handled with a stern letter and a token garrison. This was in every meaningful sense except the formal title a rival empire controlled by a ruler whose ambitions, by most accounts, extended toward eventually claiming imperial status outright for herself and her son, rather than remaining forever a nominal servant of a distant, increasingly irrelevant Roman throne. And here's the quirky, lesser-known detail that tends to delight people once they hear it, because it reveals something genuinely fascinating about how Zenobia chose to legitimize her rule beyond mere military conquest. She cultivated an elaborate claimed lineage, tracing her ancestry back to Cleopatra, the last great Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt, a connection modern historians view with considerable skepticism, but which served her extraordinarily well as propaganda, casting her not as a rebellious provincial governor's widow overstepping her station, but as the rightful inheritor of an ancient royal tradition, stretching back centuries, entitled to rule not by Roman permission but by blood and destiny both. Whether she genuinely believed this lineage or simply understood its political usefulness, historians still debate. But either way, it reveals a ruler thinking several steps ahead of her rivals, crafting not just military power, but the story that would justify wielding it. Aurelian, watching all of this unfold from Italy while he had been consumed with tribal invasions and city walls, cannot allow this situation to continue indefinitely, not simply out of wounded imperial pride, though there is surely some of that too, but for the coldly practical reason that Rome desperately needs Egypt's grain and the East's enormous tax revenue to have any realistic chance of stabilizing the rest of his shattered empire. And so, with Italy finally secure behind him, he begins the long, difficult process of turning an army west and north until now, toward an entirely different horizon eastward toward the deserts of Syria, toward a golden city, rising improbably from the sand, and toward a confrontation with a queen who has, by every measure available to her, built something genuinely worth defending, problem side, and who has absolutely no intention of surrendering it, without a fight. The march east is long, grinding, and deliberately unhurried, in a way that reveals something important about how Aurelian has evolved as a commander since the early days of his reign. This is not the impulsive general who charged headlong into the forests near Placentia, trusting raw aggression to carry the day. This is a man who has learned at enormous cost that underestimating an enemy is the single most dangerous mistake a commander can make, and Zenobia's forces, unlike the tribal coalitions he faced in Italy, are not disorganized raiders. They are a disciplined, well-equipped army built around a weapon that Roman soldiers have learned to fear with good reason. You need to picture this weapon properly, because it is genuinely unlike anything most of Aurelian's soldiers have faced before. The cataphract, the heavily armored cavalryman that forms the elite core of Palmyrene military power, is a terrifying sight on any battlefield, both horse and rider encased in overlapping scale or plate armor from head to hoof. The horse itself protected almost as thoroughly as the man riding it, wielding a long lance capable of skewering infantry before they can even bring their own weapons to bear. Picture the sound alone, the deep rolling thunder of hundreds of armored horses building to a gallop, a wall of iron and muscle bearing down with a momentum that can shatter an unprepared infantry line in a matter of seconds. Roman soldiers who had never encountered this kind of force before understandably found it deeply unnerving, the stuff of nervous campfire conversation the night before an expected battle. Zenobia's army, commanded in the field, primarily by her trusted general Zabdas, moves to intercept Aurelian's advancing forces near the city of Antioch, one of the great metropolitan centers of the ancient world, and a strategic prize neither side can afford to lose. And here is where you have to appreciate the psychological dimension of what's about to happen, because Zabdas and his cataphracts have every reason for confidence. This is a force that has already proven itself capable of extending Palmyrene control across enormous stretches of territory, and against most opponents, the sheer physical shock of a cataphract charge would likely prove decisive within 2 minutes. But Aurelian, remember, has spent his entire adult life studying exactly this kind of problem. How do you defeat an enemy whose strength appears at first glance to be nearly unstoppable? And here is what you have to understand about his solution, because it reveals the particular flavor of his genius, the same instinct that once made him such a formidable cavalry commander himself. Rather than meeting the cataphract charge head-on with his own heavy infantry, absorbing the full brutal weight of that armoured assault in a contest of pure physical endurance, Aurelian orders something that must have seemed to soldiers, watching it unfold in real time, almost inexplicable. His own lighter cavalry units are instructed not to stand and fight the oncoming cataphracts directly, but to retreat before them, drawing the heavily armoured horsemen further and further from their own supporting infantry lines. You have to picture the scene from Zabdas's perspective for a moment, because understanding his miscalculation is the whole key to what happens next. Watching Roman cavalry break and flee before his cataphracts must have felt in the moment like exactly the outcome he expected, exactly the kind of overwhelming psychological dominance his elite force was built to produce. So he presses the pursuit understandably, because what commander wouldn't chase down a fleeing enemy when victory seems to be handing itself to him? But here is the cruel, elegant trap Aurelian has laid. And here is what you have to understand about the fatal weakness hiding inside all that magnificent armor cataphracts, for all their terrifying power in a short, sharp charge, are exhausting to fight in for any extended period. The sheer weight of armor covering both rider and horse, combined with the searing heat of the Syrian summer sun beating down on metal that quickly becomes almost unbearably hot to the touch, means that a prolonged pursuit, however tempting, comes at an enormous physical cost. By the time Zabdas's cataphracts have chased the retreating Roman cavalry well beyond the point of easy return, exhaustion has begun setting in, both for the heavily laden horses and for the men encased in armor that traps heat mercilessly against their bodies. And this is precisely the moment Aurelian has been waiting for. His forces turn, no longer fleeing, but suddenly savagely, counterattacking an enemy that finds itself overextended, exhausted, and increasingly disorganized after a long, grueling chase across difficult terrain. The devastating physical power that made the cataphract charge so terrifying in its opening minutes becomes in this moment of collapsed discipline and mounting fatigue a liability rather than an advantage. Here is the striking mainstream historical fact worth sitting with, because it captures something genuinely important about how ancient warfare actually worked. Contrary to the popular image of battles decided purely by brute strength, this engagement near Imai, close to Antioch, stands as one of history's clearest examples of a lighter, more mobile force defeating a heavily armored elite through tactical patience and psychological manipulation rather than matching force with force. Aurelian understood something his opponents did not fully appreciate, that the most intimidating weapon on a battlefield is not always the most effective one, and that discipline in retreat can be just as valuable as discipline in a charge. And here's the quirky, lesser-known detail worth savouring a small flicker of dry wit amid the brutal tactics. Some ancient accounts suggest that as the exhausted cataphracts began falling in the ensuing chaos, Roman soldiers found themselves facing the darkly comic problem of how exactly to finish off an enemy so thoroughly encased in armour that a normal sword thrust simply couldn't penetrate it, forcing improvised solutions like targeting the gaps at joints and throats with a precision that must have felt to exhausted soldiers on both sides like a grim, deadly puzzle rather than the clean heroics of legend. The victory at Imai is significant, but it is not, and Aurelian knows this immediately, the end of the campaign. Zenobia's forces, though badly bloodied, retreat in reasonably good order toward Antioch and then further south, and the truly decisive confrontation, the one that will determine whether her empire survives or collapses entirely still, lies ahead. Because Zabdas, chastened but far from broken, is already regrouping his remaining cataphracts for one final desperate stand. And Aurelian understands with the particular clarity of a man who has already survived one battlefield disaster in this war that his enemy is about to gamble everything on a single decisive engagement. The road south from Antioch winds through increasingly harsh terrain, and here is what you have to understand about the mood in both camps. As the two armies converge near the city of Emesa, because this is not a battle either side approaches casually, Zabdas has had time to regroup his remaining cataphracts, reinforce them with additional troops drawn from across the territories still loyal to Zenobia, and crucially, he has had time to think through exactly what went wrong at Imai. This is not a commander who intends to repeat the same mistake twice. You need to picture the scale of what's gathering on this particular battlefield, because ancient sources, with their usual tendency toward dramatic inflation, describe both armies as substantial forces, tens of thousands of men on each side, though modern historians reasonably caution that these figures likely carry the same exaggeration common to nearly all ancient battle accounts. What is not in dispute, however, is the stakes. This is understood by everyone involved, from Aurelian down to the newest recruit, as the engagement that will likely decide the entire eastern campaign. Lose here, and Aurelian's army, already stretched thin by a long march far from its supply lines, could find itself in a position uncomfortably similar to the disaster at Placentia, deep in hostile territory with no clear path to safety. Win here, and Zenobia's carefully constructed empire may not survive the aftermath. Zabdas, having learned from Imai, adjusts his tactics in a way that should genuinely worry you if you're rooting for Aurelian, because it shows real tactical intelligence rather than simple stubbornness. Rather than relying purely on the cataphract's initial shock charge and risking the same exhausting overextension that doomed his forces before he integrates lighter, more mobile troops alongside his heavy cavalry, intending to use them to screen and support the cataphracts, preventing exactly the kind of prolonged, disorganized pursuit that Aurelian had exploited so ruthlessly in the previous engagement. And here is where the battle takes a turn that reveals just how dangerous this fight genuinely becomes, because for a significant portion of the engagement, it is Aurelian's own forces who find themselves under severe, potentially catastrophic pressure. The initial cataphract charge, this time supported properly rather than sent in alone, drives deep into Roman lines with devastating force. And ancient accounts describe Roman infantry units on one flank coming perilously close to complete collapse under the sheer weight of the assault. You have to feel the tension of this moment properly, because this is not a comfortable foregone victory unfolding according to plan. This is a battle balanced on a knife's edge where the outcome of the entire Eastern War, and quite possibly Aurelian's own survival, hangs on whether his lines can hold against pressure that seems for a terrifying stretch of the afternoon genuinely unstoppable. Here is the striking historical detail worth pausing on, because it captures the desperate improvisational nature of ancient battle command in a way that pure strategy discussions often miss. Some ancient accounts credit Aurelian himself with personally riding into the most threatened sections of his line during this crisis, rallying wavering troops through sheer visible presence and force of will, a detail that, whether precisely accurate in every particular or somewhat embellished by later admiring biographers, nonetheless reflects the genuine reputation he had, built over decades as a commander who led from danger, rather than from comfortable distance. Whatever the exact truth of his personal movements on that field, the Roman line, battered and pushed to its absolute limit, does not break. And this is where Aurelian's deeper preparation, the kind that happens long before any battle begins, finally pays its full dividend. Because while Zabdas had focused his tactical adjustments on protecting his cataphracts from the specific trap that undid them at Ime, Aurelian had spent the intervening time studying something else entirely: the religious and cultural dimensions of the forces arrayed against him. Some ancient sources suggest that as the battle reached its most critical, uncertain phase, Aurelian's forces began deliberately targeting and disrupting elements of Zenobia's army connected to local religious symbolism and morale, exploiting divisions and uncertainties within a coalition that, for all its military sophistication, was still fundamentally an alliance of diverse peoples rather than a single unified force with unshakable common cause. Historians still debate the precise mechanics of exactly how this psychological and tactical pressure was applied, since the surviving accounts are frustratingly vague on specifics, but the broader pattern is clear enough. Aurelian understood that Zenobia's empire, however impressive its military hardware, rested on a foundation of alliance and loyalty that could be cracked under sufficient pressure in ways that pure Roman steel alone might never achieve. As the afternoon wears on, the tide that had seemed so firmly in Zabdas's favor begins gradually and then with increasing speed to turn. The cataphracts, having committed fully to their assault without the option of the disciplined, patient withdrawal that preserves an army's strength for another day, find themselves increasingly isolated as supporting units waver and, in places, to begin to break entirely. What began the day as a battle, Aurelian's forces seemed genuinely at risk of losing ends by evening as a comprehensive Roman victory, though a far more costly and far more uncertain one than the earlier triumph at Ime. Here's a small, quietly human detail worth sitting with amid all this brutal tactical maneuvering, a flicker of dark humor that ancient soldiers themselves might have appreciated. Surviving accounts suggest that in the battle's chaotic aftermath, Roman forces found the field littered with abandoned cataphract armor, discarded by exhausted or wounded riders, desperate to move faster on foot than their magnificent but suddenly useless metal shells would allow. An ironic final indignity for a weapon system built entirely around the promise of overwhelming, unstoppable power. Zabdas, along with whatever forces he can still command, retreats from the field in the gathering dusk, and word of the defeat travels south ahead of him, reaching Zenobia in her own capital with a message that even her considerable resolve cannot easily dismiss. The battle that was supposed to decide the Eastern War has indeed decided it, though not in the direction her general had hoped. But Zenobia herself, remember, is not a ruler who built an empire through half measures or easy surrender. And as Aurelian's victorious but exhausted army begins the final march toward her glittering desert capital, she is already preparing her own response to a crisis that would have broken a lesser monarch entirely. Palmyra rises from the desert like something that shouldn't exist, and you have to picture Aurelian's army approaching it for the first time to fully appreciate the strangeness of the sight. After weeks of marching through increasingly barren, sun-scorched terrain, the kind of landscape that seems actively hostile to human settlement, the horizon suddenly resolves into columns of pale stone, stretching in long, elegant colonnades. Monumental arches framing streets, wide enough for chariots to pass 3 abreast temples, with soaring facades catching the desert light in a way that must have seemed almost supernatural to soldiers who had spent the previous month staring at nothing but sand and scrub. This is a city built on centuries of caravan wealth, on the tolls and taxes collected from merchants moving silk and spice between the Roman world and the distant riches of Persia and India beyond. And it shows in every carved capital, every fantastic, gilded rooftop. And here is what you have to understand about the strategic problem this city presents to Aurelian, because Palmyra's location, the very thing that made it so fabulously wealthy as a trading hub, also makes it a genuinely difficult military target. It sits deep in the desert, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest reliable water source outside its own famously abundant springs, connected to the wider world by caravan routes that Zenobia's forces know intimately, and Aurelian's soldiers do not. A siege here is not simply a matter of surrounding a city and waiting the way a besieging army might operate in the greener, better supplied regions of Italy or Gaul. Every drop of water, every sack of grain for Aurelian's own army has to be hauled across brutal desert terrain, vulnerable at every step to raids from local tribes, still loyal to Zenobia, who understand this landscape and its hidden wells far better than any invading force possibly could. Zenobia, for her part, has retreated behind Palmyra's fortifications with what remains of her military strength after the disaster at Emesa. And here is where you should feel a flicker of grudging admiration for her resolve, because a lesser ruler, having lost the decisive battle that was supposed to secure her empire, might have simply sought terms immediately, accepting whatever reduced status Rome cared to offer in exchange for her life and her son's safety. Zenobia does not do this. Instead, she settles in behind Palmyra's walls, with every intention of making Aurelian pay dearly for whatever victory he ultimately achieves, betting that the brutal logistics of desert warfare might accomplish what her armies, steel, could not. You have to picture the actual texture of this siege, because it bears little resemblance to the swift, decisive battles that defined the campaign up to this point. Aurelian's forces establish themselves around the city's perimeter, and the daily rhythm becomes one of grinding patience rather than dramatic confrontation, probing attacks against sections of the walls, skirmishes with Palmyrene sorties, testing Roman positions under cover of darkness, and the constant exhausting logistical struggle simply to keep the besieging army fed and watered in terrain that seems designed by nature itself to punish anyone foolish enough to camp there for an extended period. Soldiers who had marched confidently across half the empire in the preceding months now find themselves measuring progress not in miles covered, but in wells secured and supply caravans successfully defended. Here is the striking mainstream historical fact worth sitting with, because it reveals just how seriously both sides understood what was actually at stake in this siege. Palmyra's walls and defensive preparations reflected the city's status as far more than a simple provincial capital, caught off guard by Roman aggression. This was a metropolis that had spent years, arguably its entire existence, as an independent trading power, accumulating the wealth and engineering sophistication to build genuinely formidable fortifications. And ancient accounts describe Aurelian's forces facing stubborn, well-organized resistance rather than the swift collapse an easy victory might have suggested. Some ancient writers even claim Aurelian himself was wounded during the siege operations, struck by a projectile, while personally overseeing the fighting near the walls. A detail that, whether precisely accurate or somewhat embellished in later retellings meant to emphasize his hands-on courage, fits the broader pattern of a commander who consistently placed himself closer to danger than caution alone would recommend. And here's the quirky, lesser-known detail that adds a strange, almost wistful texture to this grinding siege. Palmyra's famous springs, the very water sources that had made the city's location viable in the middle of such an unforgiving desert in the first place, became a subject of genuine fascination even for the besieging Romans. Some ancient and later travelers describing the mineral-rich waters as having an almost sulphurous distinctive taste and smell that visitors found simultaneously off-putting and oddly memorable. The kind of detail that soldiers, once the siege eventually ended, likely told stories about 4 years afterward. This strange, pungent water that had somehow sustained an entire glittering civilization in the middle of nowhere. As the siege grinds on week after difficult week, the strategic calculus inside Palmyra's walls begins shifting in ways that should worry you if you're invested in Zenobia's cause, because sieges, however heroically resisted, are ultimately contests of endurance, and endurance favors whichever side can sustain itself longer. Aurelian, for all the logistical difficulties of desert warfare, commands the resources of an empire, however battered, behind him, while Zenobia, cut off from the wider trade networks and allied territories that once fed Palmyra's wealth and power, finds her position growing steadily more precarious. With each passing day, supplies that once flowed freely along caravan routes now trickle in irregularly, if at all, and the psychological toll on a population accustomed to prosperity rather than privation begins to show in ways that ancient accounts only hint at, but that anyone who has ever lived through a prolonged crisis can easily imagine. And it is into this steadily tightening vise, this slow grinding erosion of a once confident city's resources and resolve, that Zenobia finally makes the decision that will determine not just the outcome of the siege but her own personal fate entirely, a desperate, daring gamble that will send her racing across open desert under cover of darkness in one final attempt to escape the trap closing around her and somehow salvage from the wreckage of her ambitions something worth saving. The night Zenobia decides to run, you have to imagine the calculation she must have made in those final hours behind Palmyra's walls, because this is not the decision of a ruler who has simply given up. It is the decision of a ruler who has looked clearly at her dwindling options and concluded that her best remaining chance, however slim, lies not in continuing to endure a siege that grows more desperate by the week, but in reaching Persia, Rome's great rival power to the east, where she might yet secure the military support needed to salvage her empire, or at the very least her own survival and that of her son. Picture the scene as she prepares to slip out of the city, likely under cover of darkness, accompanied by a small, trusted retinue rather than any substantial military escort, because secrecy and speed matter far more than strength for what she is attempting. This is a queen who has ridden at the head of armies, who has expanded her territory through military campaigns as much as political maneuvering, and now she finds herself reduced to something far more precarious and far more human, a desperate rider crossing open desert on a fast camel, or horse gambling everything on outrunning pursuit across terrain that offers little cover and even less mercy to anyone caught exposed in it. And here is what you have to understand about why this desperate gamble, however sound in theory, was always going to be extraordinarily difficult to pull off. Because Aurelian, remember, is not a commander who leaves obvious escape routes unwatched. His scouts and cavalry patrols have spent weeks familiarizing themselves with the terrain surrounding Palmyra, learning the paths and water sources that any fleeing party would need to use. And when word reaches the Roman camp that Zenobia has slipped out of the city, Aurelian responds with exactly the kind of relentless immediate pursuit that has characterized his entire military career. Fast cavalry units are dispatched at once, riders who understand that every hour of delay gives their quarry a better chance of vanishing into territory where Roman authority holds little sway. The chase itself unfolds across open desert, and you have to feel the tension of it properly. The particular desperation of a small group trying to outrun pursuers who know the ground, know the water sources, and have every incentive in the world to catch their target before she reaches the safety of Persian territory. Ancient accounts describe Zenobia making a dash specifically for the Euphrates River, likely intending to cross into territory where Roman cavalry could not easily follow, and for a stretch of hours the outcome must have felt genuinely uncertain, a desperate race where every mile covered brought her closer to potential safety or closer to capture, depending on which side's horses proved faster and whose knowledge of the terrain proved more precise. In the end, Roman cavalry catches her reportedly just as she is attempting to cross the river close enough to freedom that the failure must have felt particularly bitter. Here is the striking mainstream historical fact worth pausing on, because the capture of Zenobia stands as one of the genuinely pivotal, almost cinematic moments of the entire Eastern campaign. A queen who had built an empire stretching across some of the wealthiest territory in the ancient world, who had commanded armies and struck her own coinage and claimed descent from Cleopatra herself, brought down not in some final dramatic battle but in a desperate chase across open desert, captured within sight of the river that might have carried her to safety. You have to sit with the emotional weight of this moment for the story's sake, because it represents a genuine trough in the emotional wave. We've been riding a moment of real human despair after the extended tension of the siege, and the flicker of hope that her escape attempt must have carried. Whatever ambitions had driven Zenobia through years of expanding her power, whatever confidence had sustained her through a grueling siege behind Palmyra's walls, all of it collapses in this single moment of capture, and the empire she had built with such determination effectively ends here on a desert riverbank rather than in any more formal surrender. Word of her capture reaches Palmyra almost immediately, and here is where you should feel the second half of this section's emotional weight. Because a besieged city that has held out through weeks of grinding hardship, sustained partly by the hope that its queen might yet return with reinforcements or some path to salvation, now learns that hope has been extinguished entirely. Ancient sources describe the city's resistance essentially collapsing once news of Zenobia's capture spreads the population and remaining defenders understanding, with the particular clarity that comes from genuine desperation, that continued resistance without their queen offers no realistic path forward. Palmyra surrenders to Aurelian shortly afterward, its magnificent gates opening not to celebration but to the quiet, exhausted resignation of a city that has run out of options. Here's the quirky, lesser-known detail worth sitting with amid this dramatic capture, a small human touch that ancient writers found worth preserving. Some accounts suggest that when Zenobia was finally brought before Aurelian, she attempted with characteristic sharpness to shift a responsibility for the rebellion onto her advisors and generals, rather than accepting it as entirely her own doing. A defense that modern readers might recognize as a rather familiar and very human instinct, the desperate reframing of a captured leader trying to salvage whatever leverage remains available to her, regardless of how thin that leverage might actually be. And here is the open loop that should carry you forward into what comes next. The question this section deliberately leaves unresolved, because Aurelian now faces a genuinely difficult decision about what to do with this captured queen and her conquered city, a decision that carries enormous symbolic weight far beyond the immediate military outcome. Does he execute her as a rebel who dared to carve an empire from Roman territory, sending an unmistakable message to any future would-be usurper watching from the shadows? Or does he choose a different path entirely, one that might prove, in its own way, to be an even more remarkable act than the military campaign that brought her low in the first place? Whatever mercy or judgment Aurelian ultimately extends towards Zenobia, it will not, as you're about to discover, be the final word on Palmyra's fate. In the days following Zenobia's capture, Aurelian makes a choice that surprises many observers, both at the time and among historians studying this period ever since, because it runs contrary to what a purely vengeful ruler might have done with a captured rival who had, after all, carved a substantial rival empire directly out of Roman territory and cost him months of grueling campaigning across desert terrain to reclaim. Rather than executing Zenobia outright, the fate that had befallen so many defeated rebels and usurpers throughout this brutal century, Aurelian decides instead to spare her life, choosing a path of calculated mercy over straightforward vengeance. You have to understand what this decision actually meant in practice, because it was not simple leniency extended out of sentiment. Ancient accounts, though they differ somewhat on the exact details, generally agree that Zenobia was preserved specifically to be paraded through Rome in Aurelian's eventual triumph. The grand ceremonial procession through which victorious Roman generals traditionally displayed their conquests and captives to the cheering, awestruck populace of the capital. This was in its own way a far more calculated form of power than simple execution. A living demonstration of Roman supremacy, a queen who had dared to challenge the empire's authority, now reduced to a captive spectacle. Marched through streets she had once hoped perhaps to rule from a position of genuine equality rather than subjugation. And here is where you should feel the dry, uncomfortable wit that this story occasionally allows itself, because ancient sources describe the elaborate care taken with Zenobia's presentation for this eventual triumph, dressing her in jewels and fine garments so heavy, according to some accounts, that she reportedly struggled under their weight during the procession, a detail that captures something genuinely strange about Roman triumphal culture. The desire to display a defeated enemy not as broken and pitiful, but as magnificently, undeniably impressive, because a queen worth capturing in such splendor only enhances the glory of the general who brought her. Lo, there's a peculiar irony buried in dressing your prisoner more richly than most free citizens will ever afford to dress themselves, all in service of making your own victory look more impressive by comparison. But before any triumph could take place back in Rome, Aurelian still has immediate practical business to settle in Palmyra itself. And this is where the story takes a turn that reveals once again just how complicated victory in this era truly was. Having secured the city's surrender and arranged for Zenobia's captivity, Aurelian leaves Palmyra with what he presumably believed was a settled, stable situation, a garrison in place to maintain order, and turns his attention back toward the long march home and the countless other administrative burdens still demanding his attention across his vast, battered empire. Here is the sharp reversal that should genuinely surprise you if you were expecting this eastern campaign to end cleanly with Zenobia's capture, because Palmyra, it turns out, is not finished resisting after all. Shortly after Aurelian's departure, the city rises in open, violent revolt against the Roman garrison he had left behind, and the exact circumstances remain somewhat murky, even to modern historians. Some ancient accounts suggest the uprising was driven by lingering resentment among Palmyra's population toward Roman occupation, a final flare of resistance from a proud, wealthy city, unwilling to accept subjugation quietly. Other accounts point toward specific grievances against the particular garrison commander Aurelian had left in charge, suggesting the revolt may have been sparked as much by local mismanagement as by any broader anti-Roman sentiment. Whatever the precise trigger, the outcome is unmistakable. The Roman garrison is overwhelmed and slaughtered, a stunning, humiliating setback delivered against a city that had only recently surrendered. You have to imagine the messenger reaching Aurelian with this news, because after everything, this eastern campaign has already cost him the grueling march across desert terrain, the desperate battle at Emesa, where his own lines nearly broke, the exhausting weeks of siege warfare, this fresh betrayal must have landed with a particular bitter fury. Here is the striking historical fact worth sitting with, because it reveals something genuinely important about the psychology of this moment and about Aurelian's character more broadly, where his initial response to Zenobia's rebellion had been calculated, patient, even merciful in its final outcome. His response to this second Palmyrian uprising is markedly, deliberately harsher. Aurelian turns his army around and marches back to Palmyra with a speed and fury that leaves little doubt about his intentions this time. And here historians must acknowledge a genuinely difficult and disputed chapter, because ancient sources describe brutal reprisals against the city following its recapture, though the precise scale of the violence, whether it amounted to something approaching wholesale slaughter of the population, as some dramatic ancient accounts suggest, or a more targeted, if still severe, punishment of those most directly responsible for the revolt, remains a matter of genuine scholarly debate. What virtually all sources agree on, however, is that Aurelian's second visit to Palmyra was markedly less merciful than his first, and that the city's magnificent temples and public buildings, the very architectural glory that had made Palmyra such a striking sight when Roman forces first approached, it suffered significant damage in the aftermath, whether through deliberate punitive destruction or the simple, brutal chaos of a city being violently reconquered. Here's the smaller, more human detail worth pausing on amid this grim reversal, a quirky footnote that nonetheless captures something real about how quickly fortune could shift in this era. Some ancient accounts suggest that even Zenobia, herself already captured and awaiting her eventual triumphal display back in Rome, found her situation growing more precarious in the immediate aftermath of this second revolt, as furious voices among Aurelian's own circle apparently argued that her earlier mercy had been a mistake, that a rebel queen who inspired this kind of continued resistance deserved a harsher fate than a golden cage and a humiliating parade, that she survived this second wave of anger and ultimately did make it to Rome for her triumphal appearance rather than meeting a quieter, bloodier end in the desert, remains one of the more remarkable threads of mercy running through an otherwise increasingly brutal campaign. With Palmyra finally definitively subdued this second time, its ambitions crushed and its magnificent independence reduced to smoking ruin, and Roman garrison Aurelian can at last turn his full attention toward the empire's remaining fracture, the one that has been waiting patiently in the west, this entire time. Because even as Palmyra burned behind him, messengers had already begun arriving with news from Gaul, where a reluctant, weary usurper named Tetricus finds himself caught in an increasingly desperate position of his own, squeezed between his own unruly, demanding army and the found for day, unmistakable knowledge that Rome's relentless, battle-hardened emperor would eventually turn his attention westward too. The journey west from the smoking ruins of Palmyra to the still defiant Gallic Empire is in every sense a journey between two entirely different worlds, and you have to feel that contrast to fully appreciate what Aurelian faces next. Behind him lies desert heat, golden stone, the perfumed intrigue of an eastern court that had briefly imagined itself equal to Rome. Ahead lies something colder, greener, and in its own way, considerably more complicated politically, because the situation waiting for him in Gaul does not resemble a queen's ambitious rebellion so much as an exhausted, reluctant ruler trapped by circumstances, largely beyond his own control. You need to understand the man currently sitting on the Gallic throne, because Tetricus is nothing like Zenobia, and appreciating that difference matters enormously for understanding what happens next. Where Zenobia had actively, deliberately built and expanded an empire through calculated ambition, expanding her territory with clear-eyed determination, Tetricus inherited a rebellion he seems, by most historical accounts, to have never particularly wanted in the first place. A former Roman senator and provincial governor, he had been elevated to the Gallic throne years earlier, not through his own scheming, but largely because the breakaway Gallic Empire's previous ruler had been murdered by his own mutinous soldiers, and Tetricus found himself, whether through genuine reluctance or simple political calculation about his own survival, accepting a crown that came with all the danger of imperial power and increasingly few of its actual benefits. And here is what you have to understand about the specific grinding misery of Tetricus's position by the time Aurelian's attention finally turns toward Gaul, because it reveals something genuinely important about why this particular breakaway empire, unlike Zenobia's fiercely defended Palmyra, proves willing to collapse with far less resistance than its considerable military strength might have suggested. The Gallic army, much like Roman forces across the empire during this turbulent century, had grown accustomed to a dangerous destabilizing habit, treating their emperors as disposable instruments to be discarded, sometimes violently. Whenever military fortunes soured or pay grew irregular, or simple opportunistic ambition suggested a change of leadership might benefit the ordinary soldier's own prospects. Tetricus, ruling over increasingly unstable, mutinous troops, finds himself less a confident sovereign, commanding unquestioned loyalty, and more a man perpetually looking over his own shoulder, uncertain whether the next threat to his throne will come from Aurelian's advancing legions or from his own restless soldiers. Here is the striking mainstream historical fact worth sitting with, because it captures just how genuinely precarious military rule had become throughout this entire fractured empire. By this point in the crisis, not merely in Rome's central territories, but within the breakaway states as, well, the Gallic Empire. For all its earlier success at defending its own borders more effectively than distant Rome had managed, was not somehow immune to the same corrosive instability plaguing the wider Roman world soldiers who had learned through repeated, bitter experience across an entire generation of civil wars. And, as Europeans, that loyalty to any particular emperor was a far less reliable investment than loyalty to whichever leader could guarantee their pay and their safety most immediately. And this is where the story begins to acquire a genuinely fascinating layer of ambiguity and quiet political maneuvering, because as rumours and fragmentary accounts from this period suggest, Tetricus appears to have begun, perhaps out of sheer exhausted self-preservation, contemplating an arrangement that would have seemed almost unthinkable only a few years earlier, some kind of accommodation, however informal or carefully concealed, with the very emperor whose armies were now advancing toward his territory. You have to imagine the extraordinary psychological position this puts him in, a ruler technically commanding a rival empire, yet increasingly viewing the approaching enemy not as his greatest threat, but perhaps, strangely, as a potential solution to the far more immediate danger posed by his own unreliable, mutiny-prone soldiers. Historians still argue fiercely about exactly how much substance lies behind these rumours of secret contact between Tetricus and Aurelian, and this genuine scholarly debate deserves to be raised honestly rather than resolved with false certainty, because the surviving evidence is frustratingly indirect, filtered through later writers who had every incentive to shape the story in ways that made Aurelian's eventual victory look either more dramatically decisive or more cleverly orchestrated than the messier historical reality might actually support. Some historians lean toward genuine skepticism, suggesting the later stories of secret collusion were largely invented or exaggerated after the fact, a convenient narrative that let both Tetricus and Aurelian save face regarding what was in truth simply a straightforward military defeat. Others find the circumstantial evidence considerably more persuasive, pointing to specific details in the ensuing battle and its aftermath that seem difficult to explain without at least some prior understanding between the two men. Here's the quirky, genuinely intriguing detail that keeps this ambiguity so tantalizing for historians. Centuries later, a small human touch amid the larger political maneuvering. Later, Roman sources claim that Tetricus, communicating with Aurelian through secretive channels before their armies ever formally clashed, allegedly quoted a line from the famous Roman poet Virgil in a coded message, a subtle literary reference meant to convey his willingness to surrender without making that intention explicit enough to be discovered by his own suspicious officers and soldiers. Whether this specific charming detail is genuine history or a later embellishment designed to add literary flourish to an already dramatic story, historians cannot say with certainty, but it captures something real about the desperate, careful communication that any such secret arrangement would have required in an era where a single wrong word, overheard by the wrong soldier, could mean instant violent death for a ruler, already teetering on the edge of his own armies. Patience. What remains beyond serious dispute, regardless of how one reads these tantalizing rumors of secret contact, is the simple fact that Tetricus's position by this point had become genuinely untenable, caught between an approaching Roman army led by history's most relentlessly successful general of the age, and an unruly domestic force of his own soldiers who had already demonstrated, through the fate of his own predecessor, exactly how quickly they were willing to turn violent against a ruler who disappointed them. And so, as Aurelian's forces finally cross into Gallic territory, and the two armies begin maneuvering toward what both sides understand will likely be a decisive confrontation, Tetricus rides toward this coming battle, carrying a burden considerably heavier than simple military strategy, the weight of a decision that may determine not just the fate of his rebellious empire, but quite possibly his own survival, regardless of which side ultimately claims victory on the battlefield. As the two armies draw closer to what both sides sense will be a decisive reckoning, the whispered rumours of secret contact between Tetricus and Aurelian only grow thicker, And here is what you have to understand about the peculiar tense atmosphere settling over both camps in these final days before battle, because it is not the straightforward atmosphere of two enemies preparing for a clean, honest fight. It is something murkier, charged with an undercurrent of suspicion that seems to hang over the Gallic camp, especially where ordinary soldiers sharpening their weapons and checking their equipment in the grey light before dawn cannot entirely shake a nagging unease about their own emperor's intentions. You have to imagine what it would feel like to be one of these soldiers, a man who has fought under the Gallic banner for years, who has watched one emperor already murdered by his own mutinous comrades, and who now finds himself wondering in the quiet, private moments before what everyone understands will be a massive, likely decisive battle. Whether the man commanding him from the rear actually intends to lead them to victory, or whether some darker, more complicated arrangement has already been struck that renders their coming sacrifice essentially meaningless. This kind of corrosive doubt, even if never spoken aloud, even if entirely unfounded, has a way of settling into an army's collective nerve and weakening it long before the first weapon is ever drawn. Here is where the ancient sources, frustratingly but understandably, become their vaguest, because whatever precise communications may have passed between Tetricus and Aurelian in these final days, they were by their very nature meant to remain hidden from view, conducted through trusted intermediaries, rather than open declaration, coded, careful, deniable. Historians still debate whether these rumoured contacts represented a fully formed plan for Tetricus to essentially hand Aurelian a victory in exchange for personal safety and perhaps even future position within Roman society, or whether they amounted to something vaguer and more tentative, an unspoken mutual understanding that never quite crystallized into explicit terms, each man testing the water without fully committing to a course that, if discovered by his own soldiers or officers, could prove instantly, violently fatal. And here is what you have to appreciate about why this ambiguity mattered so enormously to both men, because the danger of discovery cut in both directions with equal ferocity. For Tetricus, being caught in secret negotiation with the enemy would almost certainly mean immediate death at the hands of his own furious soldiers, men who had already proven through the fate of his murdered predecessor exactly how quickly they turned violent against perceived betrayal. But Aurelian too had reasons for caution here, because a Roman emperor whose eventual victory over a rival empire appeared to rest on secret bargains and behind-the-scenes deals rather than honest battlefield triumph, risked undermining the very reputation for relentless, incorruptible military competence that had carried him this far, that had in fact been the foundation of his entire rise from frontier obscurity to the imperial throne. Here is the striking mainstream historical fact worth sitting with, because it illuminates something genuinely important about the wider pattern of this turbulent century beyond just this single episode: arrangements between rival claimants, whether fully explicit bargains or simply tacit, unspoken understandings, were not unprecedented during the crisis of the 3rd century, an era in which the boundaries between civil war and negotiated political settlement had grown increasingly blurred as exhausted rivals repeatedly discovered that outright destruction of an enemy often cost far more in blood and treasure, both, than some form of face-saving accommodation that allowed a defeated rival to step quietly aside. Whether or not the specific details of Virgil quotations and coded messages hold up to rigorous scrutiny, the broader pattern they represent of desperate rulers seeking any path other than pure costly annihilation rings entirely true to the exhausted realities of this particular historical moment. And here's the quirky, genuinely human detail worth pausing on. Amid all this careful political maneuvering, a small footnote that adds a welcome touch of dry irony to an otherwise tense situation. Some ancient sources suggest that Tetricus's own mother, a woman of considerable political sharpness in her own right, according to these accounts, may have played some behind-the-scenes role in encouraging or facilitating contact with Aurelian's camp, a detail that, whether entirely accurate or somewhat embellished by later writers fond of dramatic maternal interventions, nonetheless paints a vivid picture of a ruler surrounded not by grand strategic counselors debating imperial destiny in marble chambers, but by an anxious, tightly knit circle of family and trusted advisors, trying desperately to navigate an impossible situation with the resources actually available to them, which is to say, mostly just each other. As the morning of battle finally approaches, whatever understanding may or may not have been reached between the two commanders, the armies themselves have no choice but to proceed as though this will be a genuine contested fight, because neither side can afford to reveal through visible hesitation or unusual battlefield behavior that anything other than an honest contest is unfolding. Soldiers on both sides form up in the grey pre-dawn light near a place called Chalons, checking weapons, murmuring final prayers, watching officers for the signal that will send tens of thousands of men crashing into one another in what everyone present understands, regardless of whatever secret currents may be flowing beneath the surface, will be a brutal, costly, and very real battle. And it is here on this contested field that the fate of the Western Rebellion, and quite possibly the truth behind these tantalizing rumors of hidden bargains, will finally violently be revealed. The battle that unfolds near Chalons on this cold, tense morning is by every account that survives a genuinely brutal affair, and here is what you have to understand before the details of the fighting itself, because it matters enormously for how we interpret everything that follows, whatever quiet understanding may or may not have existed between Tetricus and Aurelian beforehand. The soldiers who actually clash on this field fight as though their lives and the fate of their respective empires depend entirely on the outcome, which in the most immediate and visceral sense they absolutely do. Picture the two great masses of soldiers advancing toward each other across open ground. The Gallic legions, hardened by years of successfully defending their own borders against tribal incursions, the central Roman government had proven unable to stop a raid against Aurelian's own battle-tested forces. Men who have already marched across half the known world in this single extraordinary campaign, from the forests near Placentia, through the deserts surrounding Palmyra, and now to this cold northern field. Both armies, whatever secret currents may have flowed beneath the surface of their leadership, are composed of genuinely skilled, disciplined soldiers. And the initial clash reflects exactly that grim competence, a brutal, close-fought struggle rather than any kind of choreographed, predetermined outcome. Here is where the ancient sources, ever tantalizing and ever frustratingly incomplete, offer the detail that has fueled centuries of historical speculation about the true nature of this battle. According to several ancient accounts, at some critical juncture in the fighting, Tetricus and a portion of his senior command structure are described as essentially abandoning their own troops mid-battle, withdrawing from the field or surrendering directly to Aurelian in a manner that left the remaining Gallic soldiers suddenly catastrophically leaderless in the middle of an ongoing desperate fight. You have to imagine what this would have felt like from the perspective of an ordinary Gallic soldier, fighting fiercely, trusting that his officers and emperor remained committed to the same cause, only to discover, in the chaos and confusion of battle, that the command structure above him had simply evaporated, leaving him and his comrades to face Aurelian's forces essentially alone. Whether this apparent abandonment represents the fulfillment of that long-rumoured secret arrangement, a carefully orchestrated betrayal designed precisely to hand Aurelian victory while sparing Tetricus's own life, or whether it instead reflects a more chaotic, unplanned collapse of leadership under the genuine, overwhelming pressure of battle, remains even now a matter of real scholarly disagreement. Historians still argue over which reading better fits the surviving evidence, and honestly, the truth may sit somewhere frustratingly between the two extremes, a tentative prior understanding that only fully crystallized into actual betrayal once the battle's chaos made such a choice, both possible and, from Tetricus's perspective, perhaps unavoidable. What is not disputed, regardless of which interpretation one favors, is the brutal cost paid by the ordinary soldiers left fighting on that field. With their command structure collapsing at the worst possible moment, Gallic resistance begins to fracture and then break entirely, and the battle, whatever careful political maneuvering may have preceded it, ends in genuine, considerable slaughter. Here is the striking mainstream historical fact worth sitting with, because it captures something important and often overlooked in stories that focus primarily on emperors and generals, regardless of whatever bargain their leaders may or may not have struck the ordinary soldiers on both sides paid. The full brutal price of this battle in blood, a sobering reminder that political accommodation at the top of a conflict rarely translates into mercy for the men actually doing the fighting and dying on the ground. And here's the darkly ironic detail worth pausing on. Amid this grim outcome, a flicker of the dry wit. This story has occasionally allowed itself, even at its heaviest moments. Several ancient sources suggest that Aurelian in the aftermath of the battle made a point of publicly, theatrically, blaming the defeated Gallic soldiers themselves for their own downfall, framing the battle's outcome as a simple, honest demonstration of Roman military superiority rather than acknowledging any hint of prior arrangement with their now captured emperor. A piece of calculated political theatre that served everyone's interests. Simultaneously, it preserved Aurelian's crucial reputation for winning through pure battlefield competence rather than backroom deals, while also sparing Tetricus from the appearance of having orchestrated his own soldiers' slaughter, even if in the quiet, unspoken reality behind the public narrative, something considerably murkier may well have transpired. With the Gallic army broken and its leadership either captured or fled the breakaway Western Empire that had endured for well over a decade, surviving multiple changes in leadership and repeated Roman attempts to reclaim it, collapses with a day. Speed that must have felt almost anticlimactic after such a long grinding build-up of tension and rumour. Tetricus himself, rather than facing execution, as a captured rebel might reasonably expect, is instead treated with a leniency that in hindsight lends considerable weight to those persistent rumours of prior arrangements, spared, and eventually, remarkably, granted a position of genuine honour within Roman administrative structures, a fate that seems almost impossible to explain as simple magnanimity toward a defeated enemy, and far easier to explain as payment for services quietly rendered. And so, with Chalons decided, and the Western rebellion finally definitively ended, Aurelian achieved something that would have seemed almost impossible only 5 years earlier. Standing amid the wreckage of a plague-ravaged, coin-debased, 3 times fractured empire that everyone, from senators to ordinary citizens, had quietly begun to fear might never be whole again. The Gallic Empire is gone. Palmyra lies subdued behind him. Italy itself stands protected by walls that did not exist when this journey began. What remains now is not another battle, not another desperate campaign against a determined rival, but something, in some ways, far stranger for a man who has spent his entire adult life as a soldier, the task of actually governing the vast, reunified empire. He has spent 5 brutal years rebuilding piece by bloody piece and returning home to a capital that has not seen its emperor, or a truly united empire, in longer than most of its citizens can comfortably remember. The road back to Rome feels different from every other march Aurelian has undertaken across these 5 extraordinary years, and you have to sit with that difference for a moment, because for the first time since he first took the throne amid the wreckage of a dying empire, he is not marching toward a battle. He is marching toward a triumph. The grand ceremonial procession Roman generals had celebrated for centuries, and the sheer scale of what he brings back with him reflects the almost unbelievable scope of what he has actually accomplished. In the space of 5 years, a span so short that contemporaries must have found it genuinely difficult to comprehend, Aurelian has reunified an empire that had fractured into 3 separate, competing powers, defeated invading tribal coalitions that had come within a hair's breadth of threatening Rome itself, and crushed 2 entirely different rebel empires on opposite ends of the Mediterranean world. Picture the triumphal procession itself as it winds through Rome's streets, crowds pressing close on either side, the air thick with noise and spectacle after years of anxious uncertainty about whether the empire would even survive intact. Here is where Zenobia finally makes her appearance in the story of Aurelian's homecoming, paraded through the streets in the elaborate golden chains and jewels. Ancient sources describe a captured queen displayed as living proof of Roman supremacy restored, and Tetricus too remarkably walks in this same procession not as a grovelling captive awaiting execution, but according to several ancient accounts dressed in a manner that preserved at least some dignity, a detail that continues to feed those persistent old rumors about whatever quiet arrangement had passed between the two men before Chalons ever began. Here is the striking mainstream historical fact worth sitting with, because it captures something genuinely remarkable about how Aurelian chose to mark this restoration beyond the spectacle of the triumph itself. He adopts with real, ceremonial significance the formal title Restitutor Orbis Restorer of the world, a title that appears on his coinage and official inscriptions from this point forward, and one that, unlike so much of the exaggerated propaganda this troubled century regularly produced, actually seems to reflect something close to earned reality rather than empty flattery. Few Roman emperors before or after could claim to have personally, physically ridden the length and breadth of their fractured realm, defeating rival after rival, and returned having genuinely reunified what had been three separate warring states into one functioning empire again. But Aurelian, remember, was never simply a soldier who happened to win battles, and here is where his story takes a turn towards something quieter, but arguably just as consequential as any military campaign, because he understood with the same practical clarity that had once made him such an effective logistics organizer decades earlier, that reuniting the empire's territory meant very little if its underlying economic and religious foundations remained as broken as they had been when he inherited the throne. He turns his attention almost immediately upon returning to Rome toward the empire's catastrophically debased coinage, the same worthless, barely silver coins that had forced soldiers into barter economies and merchants into open distrust of their own currency. Aurelian initiates a significant currency reform, introducing new coinage with improved, more consistent silver content and standardized weights. An attempt to restore at least some measure of genuine confidence in Roman money after decades of inflation and debasement had eroded it almost entirely. Here's the quirky, lesser-known detail worth pausing on because it reveals something about how seriously and how personally Aurelian took this economic crisis. His currency reform efforts apparently provoked such fierce resistance from mint workers in Rome, some ancient accounts suggest due to corrupt practices they feared losing under stricter new standards, that it actually erupted into a genuine violent uprising within the city itself, requiring military force to suppress a strange and almost darkly comic footnote in which the empire's restorer found himself quite literally fighting a small urban battle against his own coinmakers in the purse streets of the very capital he had worked so hard to save. Alongside his economic reforms, Aurelian also turns his attention toward religious matters, and here you should feel the particular ambition of a ruler trying to find something, anything capable of binding together an empire whose citizens increasingly worshipped a bewildering variety of different gods across its vast, culturally diverse territories. He elevates the worship of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, to a position of unusual prominence within official Roman religion, constructing a magnificent new temple in the god's honor and establishing new priesthoods and ceremonies. An attempt historians generally agree to create a unifying religious focus that might transcend the empire's many regional and ethnic divisions, a single celestial symbol, powerful enough to represent Roman authority and cosmic order both. Historians still debate exactly how much of this religious program reflected Aurelian's own genuine personal devotion versus a calculated political strategy for empire-wide unity, though the two motivations, as is so often the case with ancient rulers, likely intertwined rather than existing as entirely separate impulses. And here is the open loop that should carry you forward into this story's final chapter, the quiet, unsettling undercurrent running beneath all this genuine triumph and reform, because for all his extraordinary success at reuniting a shattered empire, defeating a warrior queen, crushing a breakaway Western state, and even beginning the difficult work of economic and religious restoration, Aurelian remains at his core exactly what he has always been: a hard, uncompromising disciplinarian who demands absolute loyalty and punishes betrayal without hesitation. The same iron temperament that once made him a feared and respected commander on the Danube frontier decades earlier, and that unyielding, unforgiving character The very quality that had carried him through 5 years of impossible military campaigns is about to intersect with a small, seemingly minor act of deception among his own inner circle, setting in motion a final shocking turn that not even a man who had survived Placentia and Emesa and the desert chase for Zenobia herself will manage to see coming in time. The plot that ends Aurelian's extraordinary life begins, according to nearly every ancient source that addresses it, with something almost absurdly small. And here is what you have to appreciate about the particular tragedy of this ending, because after 5 years of surviving ambushes and cataphract charges and desert chases across hostile terrain, the man who dies is not brought down by any grand enemy or rival power. He is brought down by a lie and by his own famously unforgiving temperament reacting to it in exactly the way that temperament had always reacted to perceived betrayal. The story, as most ancient accounts preserve it, centers on a secretary or administrative official within Aurelian's own household, a man named Eros, who had apparently committed some relatively minor offense, some small act of dishonesty, or misconduct serious enough to fear punishment, but almost certainly not serious enough in any reasonable accounting to warrant the response it eventually triggers. And here is what you have to understand about why this small offense becomes so catastrophically dangerous. Because Eros, evidently well acquainted with exactly how severely and swiftly Aurelian dealt with betrayal or dishonesty among those closest to him, appears to have concluded that honest confession carried too great a risk, and that his only realistic path to self-preservation lay in a desperate preemptive deception of his own. According to the accounts that survive, Eros forges a document, a list, purporting to name several of Aurelian's most senior military officers as targets for imminent execution, and shows this fabricated list to the very men whose names appear on it, hoping to trigger exactly the kind of panicked, preemptive action that would divert attention entirely away from his own comparatively minor misdeed. You have to sit with the cruel, almost darkly comic irony embedded in this scheme for a moment, because it works precisely by exploiting the very reputation Aurelian had spent his entire career building, a reputation for absolute, uncompromising severity toward anyone he judged, disloyal, a reputation so thoroughly established, so consistently reinforced by decades of harsh discipline stretching all the way back to his frontier days, that hardened, battle-tested officers who had survived cataphract charges and desert warfare found the mere suggestion of the emperor's wrath credible enough to believe without independent verification. Here is the striking, almost tragic historical fact worth sitting with, because it captures something genuinely important about how power and fear operate, even around a ruler who has otherwise proven himself remarkably capable and in his own severe way fair. The very qualities that made Aurelian such an effective emperor, his relentless intolerance for disloyalty, his willingness to punish betrayal without hesitation or excessive mercy, become in this single moment the exact vulnerability that a desperate, frightened subordinate exploits to save his own skin, turning the emperor's greatest strength as a leader into the mechanism of his own destruction. The officers named on the forged list, believing themselves genuinely marked for death, do not wait to seek clarification or plead their case. In the autumn of 275, while Aurelian is travelling with his army through Thrace in the process of organising what would have been yet another major campaign, this time against the resurgent Persian Empire far to the east, these panicked officers strike first, ambushing and killing the emperor before he ever learns the accusation against him was entirely fabricated. You have to feel the particular bitter tragedy of this moment, because this is a man who survived Placentia's forest ambush, who personally rallied wavering troops at Emesa when his own lines seemed on the verge of collapse, who chased a fleeing queen across open desert and crushed 2 separate rebel empires through 5 years of unrelenting, brilliant campaigning, cut down not by any of these formidable enemies, but by his own frightened subordinates acting on a lie born from one small man's fear of a punishment that likely would never have equaled the catastrophe his deception ultimately caused. And here's the quietly devastating detail worth sitting with as this remarkable story draws to its close, because ancient sources describe the murdering officers once the full truth of Eros's deception became apparent in the aftermath, reacting with genuine horror and remorse at what they had done, understanding too late that they had killed the very emperor who had rebuilt their entire fractured world based on nothing more than a forged piece of parchment, and a fear that in hindsight had needed only a single honest conversation to dissolve entirely. Historians still debate certain specific details of exactly how the plot unfolded and precisely how much Eros himself anticipated the fatal outcome his lie would produce. But the broader shape of the tragedy remains consistent across the surviving accounts, a genuinely senseless death for a man who had proven himself again and again capable of surviving nearly any threat except the panic of his own frightened household. The empire Aurelian leaves behind, remarkably, does not immediately collapse back into the fractured chaos he had spent 5 years repairing, and this fact alone stands as perhaps the truest measure of what he actually accomplished, because the reunified territory, the reformed coinage, the strengthened frontiers and fortified capital all endured well beyond his own sudden, shocking death, providing the essential foundation upon which later emperors would continue building toward the eventual stabilization of the Roman world. Historians of every era since have continued returning to his extraordinary 5-year reign as one of history's most remarkable examples of a single determined individual born with no advantage beyond his own iron discipline, rescuing an empire that most contemporaries had quietly begun to believe was already beyond saving. The desert wind has settled now, and the great walls Aurelian raised around Rome stand quiet under a sky slowly filling with stars. Somewhere far off, the caravan bells of old Palmyra have gone silent, and the golden colonnades rest undisturbed, holding nothing now but moonlight and memory. The armies that once marched across half a fractured world have long since laid down their spears. The rivers Zenobia crossed in her desperate flight flow gently, now dark and unhurried, carrying nothing more urgent than starlight on their surface. Picture it all growing softer the way a scene grows. Softer just before sleep, the walls of Rome fading to a pale outline against the horizon, the cataphracts and their thunder dissolving into silence, the coins and the temples and the long, dusty roads settling quietly into the earth where they have rested peacefully for so many centuries now. The restorer of the world found his rest too long ago, and the empire he rebuilt became in time simply another gentle layer of the past, folded softly beneath everything that came after. There is nothing left to fight for tonight. No walls to build, no queen to chase, no army waiting beyond the frontier. Just quiet, just stillness. The past is at rest, and it asks nothing more of you now than to close your eyes. Let the stars dim, let your breathing slow. The world is quiet, and it is time for deep sleep.